we are so excited to be able to share with you the passion that is on our heart. And I'm going to tell you what that is. It's about justice. Over the last couple of years, we have seen so much change in our world. But one of the things that has come to my attention is the very importance of justice. And not only justice, but justice from a kingdom point of view. Justice from God's point of view. We believe justice from God's point of view is the highest level of justice. Not only that, but we also know, according to the book of Psalms 89, that justice and righteousness are the foundations of his throne. In fact, when he decided to form the nation of Israel, one of the things that he did in terms of nation building was actually introduce his legal framework into that nation. Because it's only when a legal framework is introduced into a nation that justice can be upheld. In fact, the process of justice literally is the keeping of the upholding of the rule of law in a given sphere or in a given domain and in a given nation. It's important to understand, if we're going to have a functional society, we need functional laws that when applied, uphold justice, or that sense of equity within a nation and within its peoples, in terms of how the peoples begin to interact with each other, whether it be on a personal level or whether it be on a professional or business level or whether it be on a political level. In fact, there isn't any human activity that isn't governed by law in every single nation. There just isn't. There are laws that govern your money. There are laws that govern your sexuality. There are laws that govern how businesses are able to transact with each other. In fact, you can't go anywhere without a legal framework enforcing laws within a nation. You say, why have I discussed this? Why am I going on about this? Because it is when citizens are committed to upholding good and great laws, that is when you'll begin to see more justice in a society. Right now, there has been so many cries with regard to injustice. Of the last couple of years, there's been so many issues in our world. But let me say this to you, that if politicians, if the leaders, and if the citizens together begin to increase their commitment, should I say, to obey the rule of law, you will have a more just society. The reason why we have so much injustice in our society right now is because there is a commitment to break these laws, or not to acknowledge these laws, or to be in a state of what is called lawlessness. Okay, and this is what is causing the injustice at this present moment in time. We believe here at the Kingdom Justice Movement is simply this. Two major laws that are in the Word of God. And it simply says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. And it also said, love your neighbor as yourself. So if citizens begin to do that, those two basic foundations that carry the whole weight of the law that was revealed in the Old Testament for the nation of Israel, Jesus literally said, listen, these two pieces of legislation, I'm going to call them pieces of legislation. That's exactly what they are. If you commit yourself to obeying them, you will automatically have a better society or a more just society. Got to understand that our King is very passionate about justice. In the Word of God, in the Old Testament, and in the New, he is passionate about justice. Listen, the salvation that we've received is on the basis of justice. I'll even go around even to say that God's war with evil is on the basis of justice. You need to also catch a glimpse of a future function of Jesus Christ himself. He literally will be the judge, the one that judges every single human being. And what criteria will he be judging every human heavy human being by? It will be by the legislation of heaven that is revealed in the Old Testament, but also revealed in the New. It's important that justice can only be applied when there is a commitment to obeying the law or obeying the word. It's important to understand that. But going back to the Lord and his nation building activities of Israel, the word lets us know that he began to not only rescue the people from Egypt, but also gather them in a land in Judea. It was called the land of Canaan back then. And basically what he said, listen, you need to obey my laws, you need to obey my commandments, you need to obey my statutes in the land that I'm giving you. In other words, justice will only be upheld within that land if you obey my laws. It's not just my promises, but my laws. Again, the church needs to understand that what's based in the word of God is not just promises, but there is the law too. Okay, it's important to understand there is a legal framework, and heaven as a government has a legal framework. And our job here on the earth, as it were, is to release heaven on earth. So in other words, we've got to make our culture aware of the legal frameworks that will produce a more just society. Cannot get a better society without justice, and completely impossible. But in his workings with Israel, we begin to see a few things. We begin to see a few patterns that are there in the word of God that we can learn from. Number one, God required every single citizen in the nation to keep his commandments. And he also required every single leader, whether it be a king and a priest, every single leader that began to function in the legislative, judicial, and executive authority in the nation, he required them to obey his laws. It's important for us to see this. In fact, as a king, you were commissioned at the time to administrate the law and to administrate justice at that particular time, or that particular reign that you were given in that sphere in the nation of Israel. So the point, what I'm trying to say is simply this, that the legal framework is so important. But what we see with Israel, what we do see of Israel is simply this. There are 6 books in the Old Testament that charts the history of the nation, its beginnings, and its establishment in the region, but also its battles with corruption and seasons of reformation. So when you have a look at the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, the 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it begins to chart Israel's history right from its inception all the way to, unfortunately, its exile into Babylon, which was as a result of national corruption. You see a cycle between corruption and you see a cycle of reformation. And this particular nation began to go through that particular cycle. Why am I mentioning it? It's simply because every single nation on the planet has gone through similar cycles of corruption, and then cycles of reformation, or cycles of reform. So why am I mentioning this? Because I believe there has to be a voice of reform, or a voice of reformation in the earth. We've got to be able to see the state our nations are in and have a level of discernment to say, listen, this is evil, this is national corruption, and begin to call it out. Why am I talking about this? Because if we're going to learn from the nation of Israel, we've got to learn this lesson. Corruption has to be addressed. Evil has to be resisted. Unless evil is resisted, evil is allowed. Unless evil is resisted, evil is allowed in a region. And I'm going to say this to you, we've been trained, especially in our democracies, to depend on the governmental, the executive, judicial and legislative branch and believe these are the guys that have to bring justice. No, 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 no. We've got it wrong. Justice begins in the heart of an individual. Justice begins in the heart and the mind of an individual. Then it is extended into that person's family. Then it's extended into the community. I hope you're seeing what I'm saying. Because if you're going to wait for governments to snap themselves out of corruption, you're going to wait a very, very, very long time. Look in history. It has been ordinary people that have resisted the overreach of governments and the evil contained within it. We're looking to say, I've done my duty when I vote. No, that's not good enough any longer. We have to hold our leaders to a higher standard. It's important that we do this and understand that there's got to be a cry for justice, and it needs an expression through ordinary citizens just like you and me. It has to be addressed. So one of the things that we're doing within the kingdom justice movement is to call for reform, is to call out corruption, call out the evil, call out the injustice where we see it, and begin to partner with God in terms of bringing his justice system, his justice in the nations of the earth that we represent. But not only that, but also in the nations of the earth that we live in. We need to understand that the purpose of any legal framework is literally there to uphold justice and to uphold truth, not an ideology nor a narrative. Unfortunately, in the West, that's what the legal systems are beginning to represent. They're representing ideologies, not necessarily objective truth that will make sure that justice is upheld. We've got to hold our nations to a biblical standard. We've got to become a prophetic voice to our nations and say, no, enough simply is enough.
Today, the data from the Office for National Statistics, this gives us a snapshot of the number of people we expect to die in any given period, people because of heart attacks and cancer and everything else, and how many people are actually dying. So these are excess deaths over and beyond what you would imagine for people for that period. So we had 14,530 people who died in England and Wales in the week to 23 December. Now that's the highest amount during any week of last year. And when we compare that to averages from previous years, it means nearly 2,500 more people died than expected. So that's for that 1 week alone. But over the past 6 months, the total number of excess deaths is over 30,000 in England and Wales. There have been exactly 8,000 deaths due to COVID in that period. And if we exclude those from the total, it means there's been an extra 22,040 deaths not caused by COVID in the past 6 months alone, equivalent to 848 a week. We don't know what is driving those excess deaths yet. It's too early, but certainly according to the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, they said last week that they suspected the NHS pressures has contributed to up to 500 excess deaths. That figure has been disputed by the government and NHS England, saying it's not because of NHS pressures, but certainly there are some fears that those extra pressures on the NHS is driving those excess deaths.
This constitutes a crisis, or at the very least, it constitutes a very serious investigation by governmental bodies. But the question is why is it not happening? Why isn't our government being benevolent and deciding, I'm going to do what is good for the country? 30,000 extra have died. Surely you need to be stirred into action and investigate what is going on. Well, in the House of Commons on the 13th of December, Andrew Bridgen, MP, no longer a Conservative MP, he's been stripped of his whip, but that's another story in all itself. and 4 other MPs gathered together to discuss this issue. I'm going to say to you, there's 650 MPs in the House of Commons, and less than 10 came to debate this issue. We become so politically tribal. Oh, I am right-wing, I am left-wing, I'm conservative, I'm Labour, I'm Democrat or Republican. We've become so tribal, we're missing out. We're not seeing this whole thing because 650 MPs, you got to understand this critique goes out to all of them. It goes out to all the political class. It goes out to all of them. I don't care which party it is. If 30,000 people, excess people can die, surely more than 10 MPs or more than 5 MPs can meet and discuss the issue. Surely. So what is going on? What is going on? Before I go there, though, this particular debate was triggered by the findings of a Dr. Asim Malhotra. He is an esteemed cardiologist based here in the UK, and he's been doing a lot of media rounds, social media rounds, explaining his findings with regard to the link between the vaccines and the heart conditions, myocarditis, that has been plaguing people around the world. And this particular doctor was initially a vaccine advocate, but tragedy hit, and he lost his father due to heart complications. But the issue is that his father was extremely fit for his age and shouldn't be dying of a heart complication. And he began to wonder if there was a link between his father's death and the vaccine he recently took prior to his death. And this is what happened. So Dr. Malhotra began to do plenty of research. And the truth is very, very explosive. I'm going to allow him to explain in his own words.
The question then is, what are the harms and on what quality of evidence? On the best quality evidence, something called randomized controlled trial data, a number of scientists, Robert Kaplan from Stanford, Peter Doshi, the associate editor of the BMJ, Joseph Freeman, lead author I've spoken to, works in New York, and he's involved in research in one of the ERs there. They were able to get access to Pfizer and Moderna's original trials and new data. So let's just put this in perspective. These are the trials that led to the approval of the vaccines in the first place, okay? Based upon this data that was done by Pfizer and Moderna. They found that the risk of having a serious adverse event from the original trials, disability, life-changing event, hospitalization, was higher than being hospitalized with COVID. So serious adverse event from the vaccine, there was a higher risk in the original trials of it causing a problem than it was you were to be hospitalized.
So, in other words, in layman's terms, it's more dangerous to take the vaccine than not.
For most people, that's what we've concluded. That's what I've concluded. That's how it appears. And that rate, Tucker, is at least 1 in 800. The question is, how did this all happen? And the only way to really explain it is to take a step back. I'm a root cause guy, right? So you talk about the evidence-based medicine triad, you look at best available evidence, you go back, right? So what are clear hard facts to try and understand this? One is drug companies have a fiduciary legal obligation to produce profit for their shareholders. They do not have a legal obligation to give you the best treatment, right? But the real scandals are these. Regulators fail to prevent misconduct by industry,
right,
and that doctors, academic institutions, and medical journals collude with industry for financial gain. Let's talk about the regulator. You may come back to me and say...
To the detriment of public health. I mean, that's the shocking part. It's not just, you know, if you and I are working our scam or whatever and we're getting rich, but we're not killing people, okay. But people are dying. Like, what?
I know. So how do we explain it? Well, first of all, as you may know, the FDA gets 65% of their funding from pharma. Huge conflict of interest. In the UK, our regulator, the MHRA, gets 86% of their funding from pharma. So that's a big problem. And what normally happens is these trials, where Pfizer designed the trial, they did their own analysis, they hold on to what we call the raw data, which is often tens of thousands of pages on information on every patient involved in the trial, what was happening to them, did they really check side effects properly, etc. They then give summary results to the regulator who then approves it, right?
But may I just ask a dumb question? Why wouldn't the regulator, since he's making a decision for a country of 340 million people, demand all the data?
So they get the data, but they probably don't spend time analyzing it properly. And I think also the problem is, as well, is financial conflicts of interest, Tucker. So we know, for example, in the FDA, between 2006 and 2019, 9 of the 10 FDA commissioners went on, when they left the FDA, to get very lucrative jobs with the pharmaceutical industry. It's a revolving door.
It is clear that something is wrong in a systemic and structural sense in this country. As he explained in this particular clip, the regulators in particular, the FDA in the United States and the MHRA here in the United Kingdom are funded by Big Pharma. FDA up to 60% and the MHRA 89% funded by Big Pharma. So the question is, how can they regulate something so important if they are funded by the same people? How can they remain impartial? There is something very, very wrong with the system as it stands. And the truth of the matter is, when findings begin to appear that come against the narrative, why aren't our governments doing anything about this? Why is it? I'm going to let you know, it's nothing short of what is called corruption. Something is very wrong. Pfizer and Moderna recently admitted that the vaccine wasn't able right from the get-go to stop transmissions from one person to another. In fact, this presupposition was used to legally enforce vaccine mandates in many countries around the world. Many people lost their jobs on the basis of a narrative. Are you hearing what I'm saying? On the basis of a narrative that wasn't true. People were smeared, mocked, demonized, as it were, on the basis of a narrative that wasn't true. Remember what I said, that justice depends on truth. And what we saw was legislation put in place on the basis of a narrative. And what did it do? It caused so much injustice. So many people have either died or become sick, lost their livelihoods on the basis of what happened. In other words, what I'm trying to say is simply this, that our government legislated on the interests of multinational companies instead of the health and welfare of its own citizens.
And I think the only way to address this problem is to tackle it at the root, which is, for example, my solutions are these, some very straightforward, simple ones. Although drug industry can be involved in developing drugs, they shouldn't be allowed to then test them and hold on to the raw data. The regulators shouldn't be funded by industry.
Of course not.
And politicians should not be taking money for campaign donations from Big Pharma. One of the primary purposes of government, Tucker, let's just go back to the basics, is to protect their citizens from external aggressors, but also to protect their citizens from disease and to serve the interests of the people.
The truth is, we cannot continue with business as usual. The last 2 years have shown us a few things. It has unmasked, for those of you who are discerning, it has unmasked an evil that we didn't quite see before. It's unmasked a corruption within our state that we've not seen before. It's unmarked so much. But the truth of the matter is, if evil is unopposed, it will be allowed. You know, in Hitler's Germany at the time, when he was rising up at the time, and this is a message to the church, when he was rising up at the time, the church said to themselves, you know, I am not going to get myself involved in any political viewpoints. I'm just not going to do it. We're going to stay away. We're going to pray and sing Kumbaya and pray for revival and pray for awakening. There wasn't enough active resistance to stop Hitler's rise. As I said to you before, if evil is not stopped, it will spread to a point where it turns into oppression. Are you hearing what I'm saying? And there's got to come a time, there's got to be, in this generation, I'm going to tell you my motivation. I want to make sure that my children and my grandchildren live in a better world. And for that to happen, evil has to be opposed. Corruption has to be highlighted and be opposed. And let me say this to you. Even in the Old Testament, when the nation of Israel began to slide, prophetic voices rose up and began to demand justice from their governments, justice from their leaders. We need to demand it. This is so important. So important. We are seeing a disturbing trend in our democracies where the interests of corporations and multinational businesses are being turned into legislation. And as I said to you before, a government's primary responsibility is the health and welfare of its systems, of its citizens, and not necessarily where their pockets can be lined and funded. Are you hearing what I'm saying? They're driven by interest groups, lobbyists, instead of the needs and the requirements of the people they are called to represent. And if you're an MP and you see this message, if you are an elected official and you see this message, I am calling you to a higher standard. To start representing the people that have elected you into place. Instead of greasing your pockets and earning more money and securing a future for yourself, but at the same time damning the future and trying to fool us with political language. We're not fooled anymore. We see it for what it is. And it's time for a change, and it's time for reformation or reform of our systems. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that in future vlogs in terms of creating the world we want to see and keeping those that are in power accountable. So important. And let me just say this to you. Listen, if you can feel my passion, feel the fire, and you want to make a change, why not join the Kingdom Justice movement wherever you are, so we can spread this message wherever we are, because we are looking to increase our activism in such a way. We're going to be challenging some of the purple cows, should I say the sacred cows, and say purple cows, the sacred cows that are in our society, where legislation or thinking is bringing such tremendous suffering in our society today. We want to bring the King's justice to every society, to every sphere of society. We would love you to join us. God bless. And I'll see you next month. God bless you. Bye-bye.